The first sound of autumn was not the whisper of turning leaves, but the sharp crack of an axe. It was a sound that carried far in the thin, cooling air of the high valley. Anya worked with a rhythm that was not hurried. It was the rhythm of a river, of seasons, of something that knew its destination and was not concerned with the pace of its arrival. Each swing of the axe was a clean, declarative sentence. The blade bit into the pine, and the scent of resin bled into the air, a sharp perfume against the damp smell of coming frost. Her mother, Marta, worked beside her, not with an axe, but with her hands. At 70 years, her hands were maps of a life lived by the earth. They sorted stones. She would run her palms over a piece of granite, feeling for its weight, its balance, its hidden fractures. Some she discarded. Others she placed in a growing pile, arranging them by size and shape with an architect's quiet precision. They were building a house. Or rather, they were building a shelter, a distinction the other settlers in the valley found peculiar. Down in the town, a collection of hastily erected log cabins and canvas tents, the men were also working. They were felling trees, chinking walls with mud and moss, their movements quick, almost frantic. The first winter in a new territory was a predator, and they could feel its breath. They saw Anya and her mother on the slope above the creek, not building with wood, but digging into the earth like badgers. Thomas, a trapper who had seen more winters than most, stopped his horse on the trail one afternoon to watch them. They had cleared a patch of ground and were digging a foundation, wide and deep. He saw the piles of stone, sorted like vegetables at a market. "That's a cold way to live," he called out, his voice friendly but laced with the certainty of convention. Anya paused, her axe resting on her shoulder. She did not answer. Marta looked up, her eyes pale blue like a winter sky, and gave a slow, deliberate nod that was neither agreement nor dismissal. Thomas shook his head and rode on, the sound of their solitary work, the scrape of a shovel, the thud of a placed stone, fading behind him. He thought of the husband Anya had buried just a year past, taken by a fever in a drafty cabin just like the one he was now racing to secure. He thought it a shame she had no man to build her a proper home. He did not understand that she was building one precisely because a man had not. The foundation was the heart of the thing. It was Marta's knowledge, carried across an ocean from a land of wind and rock where people learned to live not on the earth, but with it. The men in the valley laid their cabins on shallow footings of stacked rock, just enough to lift the first logs from the damp soil. Marta insisted they dig. They dug until the shovels struck the hard, unyielding clay that lay beneath the topsoil, a full 4 feet down, well below the reach of the deepest frost. The work was brutal. Anya's shoulders ached, her hands blistered and bled and healed into thick calluses. They used the felled trees as levers to move the largest stones into the trench, a foundation not of stacked rocks, but of massive, interlocking boulders that fit together like the bones in a spine. It was wider than any log wall, a full 5 feet across. Thomas came by again, this time with 2 other men from the settlement. They stood at the edge of the pit, their hands on their hips, their faces a mixture of pity and amusement. "Building a fort, are you?" one of them asked, a man named Henry. Marta was on her knees in the trench, using a smaller stone to pack dirt into a crevice. She ignored him. Anya looked up at them, her face smudged with dirt, her expression unreadable. "We're building a house," she said. Her voice was flat, without emotion. "Looks more like a root cellar," Henry's companion muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Or a tomb," the word hung in the air. Thomas felt a prick of discomfort. He saw the memory of the last winter in Anya's eyes, the hollowed-out look of a grief that had not yet settled. He knew her husband had been buried in a shallow grave because the ground had been frozen too hard to dig. Perhaps that was what this was about. A deep, defiant grave that the frost could not touch. He gestured for the other men to move on. "Leave them be," he said, his voice low. As they walked away, their laughter drifted back, thin and sharp in the crisp air. Anya and Marta did not watch them go. They returned to the silence and the work, laying the stones one by one, a bulwark against the coming cold, a foundation built not just on clay, but on the bedrock of memory. It was a promise made to the earth, "You will not take us so easily this time." The walls rose slowly, a testament to patience. They were not single walls, but two. Anya and Marta built the outer wall first, using the largest, flattest stones Marta had selected. They fit them together with painstaking care, using a mortar of clay and sand and fine gravel to fill the gaps. The wall was thick, its outer face sloped gently inward, designed not to fight the wind but to shed it, to let the force of a gale slide up and over. Behind this, they began to build a second, inner wall, leaving a space of 2 feet between the two stone skins. The men in the valley, when they passed, saw only the squat, unlovely outer wall. It had no grace, no soaring height like the log cabins they were so proud of. It looked ancient and brutish. No windows, Thomas observed to himself one day, watching from a distance. A house without eyes to see the world. It seemed a miserable existence. He could not see the purpose of the gap between the walls. But inside that gap, Anya and Marta were creating the building's lungs. They filled the space with everything the forest floor offered. They gathered great sacks of dried moss, clumps of fallen pine needles, and the dry, crumbled leaves of late autumn. They packed this mixture down, layer by layer, tamping it with heavy wooden posts until it was dense and springy. It was a layer of insulation, a thick blanket woven from the forest itself, tucked between 2 layers of stone. The work was repetitive, almost meditative. The smell inside the growing structure was rich and earthy, a scent of pine and soil and dry moss that was clean and ancient. It smelled of life, not of death. The inner wall was made of smaller, smoother stones, chosen for their feel. This would be the wall they lived against, the stone that would hold the warmth of their lives. As they worked, they did not speak much. Words were unnecessary. Their movements were a conversation, a shared language of effort and purpose. Marta would point to a stone, and Anya would lift it. Anya would test a section of the wall, and Marta would nod, her gaze seeing not just the stone, but the winter it would have to endure. They were 2 parts of a single intention, moving with the slow, unyielding force of a glacier. From the outside, it was just a pile of rocks. From the inside, it was becoming a sanctuary. A place where the world's harshness would be asked to wait at the door. The roof was the most dangerous part. They could not raise heavy log beams as the men did in town. They had only their own strength and their simple levers. Marta's design did not call for beams. Instead, they built the walls of the small, rectangular structure inward near the top, creating a corbelled effect where each layer of stone jutted out slightly farther than the one below it. This narrowed the opening at the top, which they could then span with the largest, flattest slabs of slate they had spent weeks quarrying from a nearby outcrop. It was a feat of engineering learned from ancient burial chambers and shepherds' huts in her homeland. Anya, younger and stronger, did most of the heavy lifting, her muscles straining as she and her mother maneuvered the heavy slabs into place. The roof was steep, a sharp pitch designed to shed the heaviest snow, its weight pressing downward and outward, locking the inward-leaning walls into a structure of immense stability. There was only one opening left, a square hole for the chimney. The half they built was the soul of the shelter. It was not the simple, open fireplace of the log cabins. It was a massive construction of stone and clay that took up almost the entire back wall. They built a deep firebox, and behind it, they constructed a towering, solid mass of masonry, a labyrinth of channels and chambers designed to capture the heat from the smoke before it escaped. The chimney itself was narrow and tall, with a clever bend in its flue to stop the wind from blowing straight down into the room. It was a thermal battery. The fire would heat the stone, and for hours after the flames died to embers, the great stone mass would continue to breathe warmth into the small room. It was slow to heat, but once warm, it was even slower to cool. While the men in town built fires that roared and consumed wood voraciously, throwing heat only a few feet from the flames, Anya and Marta were building a fire that would whisper, a quiet, radiant heat that would fill the entire space. They sealed the last stone of the chimney into place as the first grey clouds of winter began to gather over the mountain peaks. The shelter was complete. It was a low, rounded shape, more a feature of the landscape than a building upon it. It had one low, heavy door made of thick planks, and no other openings. It was dark, solid, and silent. It was ready. The work was not done when the last stone was laid. A fortress was useless without provisions. Anya and Marta moved with the same deliberate pace from construction to preparation. Their days were a quiet rhythm of gathering. Anya took her snares to the woods, returning with rabbits and squirrels. They did not eat them fresh. Every piece of meat was salted, smoked over a slow, cool fire of alder wood, and hung from the low ceiling of the shelter, becoming dense, dark, and preserved. Marta, her back bent but her eyes sharp, foraged. She knew the forest secrets. She found the last of the hardy autumn berries, which they crushed and dried into a leathery fruit paste. She dug for roots, bitter, starchy things the other settlers ignored, and sliced them thin to dry until they were hard as wood chips. They harvested mushrooms from fallen logs, threading them onto strings to hang near the growing warmth of the slowly curing hearth. Their stores grew, a tapestry of dried, smoked, and preserved life. Their woodpile was a work of art. The men in town chopped wood and threw it into messy piles near their cabins. Anya and Marta stacked theirs as if laying another stone wall. They had been collecting it all summer, not just felling trees but gathering fallen branches after every storm. They sorted it by type. Thick rounds of oak that would burn slow and hot, perfect for the coldest nights to charge the great stone hearth. Pine and fir for quick, bright fires to cook with. Birch for its clean, easy flame. The stack grew into a long, high wall that curved around the back of the stone shelter, providing yet another layer of insulation against the prevailing wind. It was a library of warmth, each log a promise of a night survived. Down in the valley, the preparations were more chaotic. A flurry of last-minute repairs, a rush to hunt the last of the deer, arguments over dwindling supplies at the small trading post. There was an anxiety in the air, a fear of the unknown. On the slope above the creek, there was only the quiet, methodical work of two women who had looked the coming winter in the eye and had been preparing their answer for months. Their shelter did not just contain food and wood, it contained foresight. It was a physical manifestation of their refusal to be surprised, their deep understanding that survival was not a matter of luck, but of relentless, thoughtful preparation. The first snow came not as a storm, but as a quiet apology from the sky. Soft, fat flakes drifted down, silent and slow, clinging to the pine needles and dusting the world in a coat of white. The frantic sounds from the valley below softened, muffled by the accumulating blanket. A hush fell over the land. The time for preparation was over. In their cabins, the settlers lit their fires, the smoke rising in thin, dark columns against the grey sky. They looked out through their small, precious panes of oiled parchment, watching the snow, feeling the first true bite of cold seep through the chinks in their log walls. Thomas rode out one last time to check his trap lines, his horse's hoofs making soft puffing sounds in the fresh powder. On his way back, he took the high trail that led past the women's shelter. He stopped, looking at the strange structure now settled into the landscape, its stone roof and walls covered in a layer of white, making it look even more like a natural mound of earth. The long, neat wall of firewood was a dark spine against the snow. A thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, a sign of life within. He felt a familiar pang of pity, mixed with a grudging respect for their labor. The place looked impregnable, but also like a prison. He nudged his horse closer. The heavy wooden door was shut tight. "That all?" he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "You've got no windows." The door opened a crack. Anya stood in the opening, a silhouette against a dim, warm-looking interior. The air that escaped felt noticeably warmer than the air he was breathing. She looked at the falling snow, then back at him. Her face was calm. "It is enough," she said, her voice even. She did not invite him in. She did not offer explanations. She simply stated a fact. She closed the door, the sound of the heavy bar sliding into place echoing softly. Thomas sat on his horse for a long moment, the snow collecting on the brim of his hat. He looked at his own cabin in the distance, a plume of thick, dark smoke billowing from its chimney, a fire already eating wood too quickly. He thought of the long nights ahead. For the first time, a sliver of doubt entered his mind. He shook it off, dismissed it as a trick of the cold, and turned his horse for home. The apology of the first snow was short-lived. 2 days later, the real winter arrived. It came as a presence, a physical force that scoured the valley. The wind was a solid thing, a battering ram that slammed against the log cabins. It found every crack, every poorly chinked gap, and forced its way inside with a high, screaming whistle. The fine, dry snow it carried was not soft, but sharp, like sand, driven horizontally, scouring the bark from the trees on the windward side. The world outside the cabins vanished into a churning, roaring whiteness. For the settlers in the valley, the battle began immediately. The cold was a thief, stealing the heat from their fires as quickly as they could generate it. The flames roared up the chimneys, devouring wood at an astonishing rate, yet the corners of the rooms remained frigid. Drafts slithered across the floors like snakes. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, their backs cold even as their faces were scorched by the fire. The sound was a constant assault. The shriek of the wind, the groaning of the logs as the structure strained against the pressure, the constant, unnerving rattle of the door latches. The very air inside their homes grew thin and sharp, painful to breathe. Thomas sat by his hearth, feeding it log after log. The fire was a hungry beast. He had thought his woodpile generous, but at this rate, it would not last half the winter. He could feel the cold radiating from the walls of his cabin, the log ends frosted white on the inside. He stuffed rags into the gaps around the doorframe, but the wind still forced its way through, a persistent, icy finger tracing the edges. The world had shrunk to the size of his small room, and that room was losing its fight against the vast, implacable cold that surrounded it. Hope began to feel like a rationed commodity, dwindling with every log he placed on the fire. The blizzard was not just a weather event, it was a siege, and the flimsy wooden walls of their homes were proving to be a poor defense. Inside the stone shelter, it was silent. The screaming of the wind was gone, replaced by a low, deep hum, the sound of a great power moving far away. It was the sound one might hear in the belly of a whale, the storm of the ocean a distant rumor. The thick, insulated walls did not transmit the sound, they absorbed it, swallowed it, leaving only a profound and unshakable quiet. The cold did not enter. It pressed against the outer stones, but it could not find a way through the packed earth and moss. The inner wall was not cold to the touch. It was cool, but it was the neutral coolness of deep earth, not the biting chill of a winter night. The great stone hearth radiated a steady, gentle warmth. There was no roaring fire, only a bed of deep, glowing embers from 2 logs of oak that had been placed there hours ago. The massive stone behind the firebox had absorbed the heat and was now releasing it slowly, evenly, into the small space. The air was warm and still, easy to breathe. Anya sat on a low stool, her fingers moving deftly as she mended a tear in a shirt. The only light came from the glowing embers and a single tallow candle that cast soft, flickering shadows on the smooth stone walls. Marta rested on a bed of pine boughs and firs, her breathing slow and even. She was not huddled or shivering. She was at peace. The space was small, barely larger than a single room in one of the cabins below, but it felt complete. It was a world unto itself, a pocket of calm carved out of the heart of the storm. They had smoked meat hanging from the ceiling, sacks of dried roots and berries against one wall, and a neat stack of firewood for the hearth against another. They had everything they needed. The shelter was not just a structure, it was a self-contained ecosystem of warmth and life. Outside, the blizzard clawed at the world, trying to tear it apart. Inside, 2 women sat in the quiet, warm heart of their foresight, listening to the gentle hiss of the embers, untroubled and secure. The storm could not touch them. They had built their house out of the storm's own language, stone, earth, and patience. The blizzard did not relent. For 3 days and 3 nights, it howled. The sun was a forgotten memory. The valley was buried, its contours erased, its life forced into hiding. For Thomas, the world had become a prison of cold and fear. His firewood was dangerously low. He had begun burning furniture, a stool, the extra bunk he had built. The cold had won the battle for the cabin, it was no longer a sanctuary but a trap. The frost had crawled halfway up the interior walls, encasing them in a sheath of white. His water barrel was frozen solid. He melted snow in a pot over the dwindling fire, the small amount of water it produced barely enough to wet his cracked lips. During the lulls in the wind, a terrible silence would fall, broken only by the creaking of his own joints, stiff with cold. In those moments, his thoughts turned to the two women on the hill. He pictured their stone hut, a place he had called a tomb. The image haunted him. He imagined it buried completely, the cold seeping through the stones, their small fire long since extinguished. He imagined them frozen, still, silent. A profound sense of guilt settled over him. He had laughed. He had stood by while others mocked. He had done nothing to help them, confident in his own superior knowledge of how a proper house should be built. Now, his proper house was failing him, its thin wooden skin a poor shield against the fury of the elements. He had misjudged the winter. It was a predator far more savage than he had remembered. And if he had misjudged the winter, had he also misjudged them? He pictured Anya's calm face at the door, her simple declaration, "It is enough," the words, which had seemed naive, now echoed with a wisdom he could not comprehend. He huddled deeper into his blankets, the smoke from his fire stinging his eyes. The long night stretched on, an eternity of cold and wind and the bitter taste of his own certainty crumbling into dust. He was not just fighting the storm anymore. He was fighting the chilling realization that his way of seeing the world had been wrong. On the fourth morning, the wind died. An impossible silence fell, so complete it was like a physical weight. Thomas awoke from a fitful, shivering sleep to a strange, pale light filtering through the parchment over his window. He stumbled to the door and pushed. It would not budge. He threw his shoulder against it again and again, until the frame groaned and the door scraped open a few inches, stopped by a solid wall of white. He spent the next hour digging his way out with a small shovel, his muscles screaming in protest, his breath pluming in the intensely cold, still air. When he finally emerged, the world was blinding. The sun was brilliant in a clean, blue sky, and it shone down on a landscape that had been utterly remade. Snowdrifts 10 feet high, buried fences and outbuildings. The valley was a vast, silent ocean of white. His first thought, sharp and clear, was of the women. He had to know. He strapped on his snowshoes, his movements clumsy with exhaustion, and began the arduous trek up the slope. The going was brutal. He sank to his thighs with every step, the snow a fine, dry powder that offered no purchase. It took him more than an hour to cover the few hundred yards to where he thought their shelter should be. At first, he saw nothing. Just a great, rounded drift of snow, a seamless part of the new landscape. His heart sank. They were buried. Lost. But then, as he drew closer, he saw it. A thin, impossibly straight column of pale grey smoke rising from the top of the snowdrift, climbing into the cold air without a tremor. It was the calmest, most peaceful sight he had ever seen. He floundered through the last few feet of snow until he reached a depression that marked the front of the shelter. He saw the top of the heavy wooden door, its surface clear of snow. He dug down with his hands, clearing the entrance. He hesitated for a moment, then knocked. The sound was absorbed by the snow, a dull thud. The bar slid back from the inside, and the door swung inward. A wave of warmth washed over him, a gentle, radiant heat that felt like life itself. It carried the faint scent of wood smoke and cooked meat. Anya stood there, her expression as calm as it had been before the storm. Behind her, he saw the small, quiet room, lit by the glow of the hearth. Marta sat at a small table, grinding dried roots with a stone. The air was still. The walls were bare stone, radiating a gentle heat. There was no sign of struggle, no hint of hardship. They had not just survived the storm. They had been untouched by it. Thomas stared, speechless, the cold air he had been breathing suddenly feeling thin and hostile. He looked from the peaceful room to the brutal, white world behind him. He looked at Anya's face, which held no triumph, only a quiet query. Words failed him. I misjudged it, he finally managed to say, the admission a cloud of vapor in the frigid air. Anya simply nodded, as if he had just stated the most obvious fact in the world, and stepped aside to let him in from the cold.